Hello, my friends. The war in Ukraine did not begin in February 2022, and anyone who insists otherwise is either ignorant of the historical record or deliberately dishonest. What we are witnessing today is not a spontaneous conflict triggered by Russian aggression, but the terminal phase of a long-running Western project aimed at weakening, fragmenting, and ultimately subordinating the Russian Federation. Ukraine is not the subject of this war. It is the instrument. From the Russian perspective, this conflict has always been existential. Moscow understood long before the first shots were fired that NATO's eastward expansion, the militarization of Ukraine, and the systematic transformation of Kyiv into an anti-Russian forward operating base represented an unacceptable strategic threat. Diplomatic avenues were exhausted. The Minsk agreements were never intended by the West to be implemented, a fact later admitted openly by European leaders. They were a stalling tactic, designed to buy time while Ukraine was armed, trained, and ideologically conditioned for confrontation. Statements from Russian officials consistently underline this reality. Moscow has repeatedly pointed out that Europe is not seeking peace in Ukraine. The European Union, far from acting as an independent geopolitical actor, has functioned as a financial and political appendage of Washington. Its objective is not conflict resolution, but escalation, sustained until the last Ukrainian is spent. This is not rhetoric. It is observable policy. European governments continue to funnel tens of billions of euros into a war effort that cannot succeed. These funds are not allocated for reconstruction or civilian recovery. They are directed toward prolonging hostilities, servicing arms contracts, and feeding opaque financial schemes that recycle Western money back into Western corporate and political structures. Ukraine, reduced to a hollowed-out battlefield economy, is expected to bleed indefinitely while its sponsors posture about values and democracy. The Zelensky government, meanwhile, operates as a client regime with no realistic capacity or intention to repay its debts. The notion that Ukraine will one day reimburse European taxpayers is a political fantasy. The country's industrial base is shattered, its demographics collapsing, and its sovereignty effectively outsourced. The idea of reconstruction exists only as a talking point, not a plan. Russia, by contrast, has approached the conflict with strategic patience and clarity of purpose. Its military operations have prioritized attrition over spectacle, systematically degrading Ukraine's manpower, logistics, and command structures. Western media fixates on symbolic victories and tactical noise, while ignoring the strategic trajectory. Russia is fighting a war of material reality. The West is fighting a war of narratives. Equally important is the broader geopolitical context. Russia understands that Ukraine is merely one theater in a larger confrontation with the collective West. The same actors destabilizing Eastern Europe are simultaneously applying pressure across multiple regions, using sanctions, information warfare, and proxy conflicts as standard tools. Moscow's response has been to deepen partnerships outside the Western Bloc, reinforce strategic autonomy, and demonstrate that attempts at isolation have failed. Despite unprecedented sanctions, Russia's economy has adapted. Energy exports have been rerouted, industrial capacity retooled, and financial mechanisms adjusted. The expected collapse never came. Instead, Europe now faces deindustrialization, energy insecurity, and political fragmentation as the real cost of its subservience to Washington's agenda becomes unavoidable. The Ukrainian battlefield has exposed the limits of Western military power. NATO's stockpiles are depleted. Production rates cannot match consumption. Advanced weapons systems touted as game changers have failed to alter the strategic balance. Meanwhile, Russia has expanded its defense production, integrated battlefield lessons, and maintained escalation dominance. The most uncomfortable truth for Western policymakers is that time is not on their side. Ukraine is running out of soldiers. Russia is not. Ukrainian society is exhausted, fractured by forced mobilization and mass emigration. Russia's population, economy, and political system remain stable. This asymmetry is decisive. Calls for negotiation surface periodically in Western discourse, but they are tactical, not sincere. They emerge when battlefield realities intrude too forcefully to ignore, then disappear once new funding packages or weapons deliveries are announced. Genuine diplomacy would require acknowledging Russia's security concerns and the illegitimacy of NATO's expansionist logic. That acknowledgement remains politically forbidden in Western capitals. In the end, Ukraine's tragedy lies in its instrumentalization. It has been sacrificed to sustain the illusion of Western dominance in a world that has already moved on. Russia's objective is not conquest for its own sake, but the enforcement of strategic red lines that were crossed with arrogance and impunity. This war will end not when the West decides it has had enough, but when reality imposes itself. The longer Europe delays that reckoning, the higher the cost will be for Ukraine, for European societies, and for the credibility of the Western political class itself. History will not be kind to those who mistook propaganda for strategy and escalation for strength. Russia understood the nature of this conflict from the beginning. The West is still struggling to understand that it has already lost the argument and eventually it will lose the war. In conclusion, the conflict in Ukraine has repeatedly underscored a profound truth. Technological superiority and external support, no matter how advanced, cannot substitute for disciplined strategy, operational foresight, and adaptive execution. Russia's approach, grounded in mobility, depth, and precise timing, has consistently exposed the vulnerabilities inherent in NATO-backed operations, where predictability and over-reliance on firepower often lead to costly setbacks. Each stalled Ukrainian offensive, each frustrated attempt to break fortified positions, and each miscalculated advance demonstrates the limits of Western assumptions about modern warfare. This war is not merely a contest of weapons, but a test of military art, command flexibility, and strategic patience. Russia has repeatedly shown that careful planning, decentralized decision-making, and the ability to respond fluidly to unfolding conditions outweigh sheer technological might. The battlefield, with its rivers, urban strongpoints, and industrial choke points, has become a proving ground for operational ingenuity, where conventional superiority is often neutralized by tactical acumen. Ultimately, the lessons are stark and enduring. NATO's expectation that materiel and intelligence alone could guarantee victory has been repeatedly challenged. The resilience and adaptability of Russian forces have transformed each engagement into a calculated exercise in attrition, disruption, and momentum denial. What outsiders might perceive as stalemate is, in reality, a meticulous orchestration of strategy, where each counteroffensive and tactical repositioning strengthens Russia's position while exposing the persistent flaws in Ukrainian and NATO operational planning. The ongoing conflict thus serves as a living testament to a fundamental principle of warfare. Dominance on the battlefield is not given by the weapons you possess, but by the clarity of your strategy, the cohesion of your forces, and the foresight to anticipate and exploit the weaknesses of your opponent. In this harsh calculus, Russia has repeatedly proven that mastery of operational art can outmatch even the most sophisticated adversaries, redefining the rules of engagement and challenging conventional assumptions about modern combat. Victory, it seems, is not only about the battles fought today, but about the strategic vision that shapes the campaigns of tomorrow. And in that arena, Russia has repeatedly demonstrated an advantage that mere technological support cannot easily overcome. There is a fundamental and increasingly dangerous disconnect between what Donald Trump personally claims he wants regarding Ukraine and Russia and what the entrenched national security bureaucracy of the United States continues to pursue, regardless of who occupies the White House. Trump's motivations are relatively transparent. He wants to brand himself as a peace president, to present himself as the man who ended a bloody and unnecessary war, and to reopen commercial channels with Russia that could produce financial and political benefits. That ambition, however, is shallow and transactional. It is not grounded in strategic thinking, historical awareness, or a genuine reassessment of America's global posture. In contrast, the so-called deep state The permanent intelligence, military, and foreign policy apparatus remains firmly committed to a long-standing project, weakening, fragmenting, and ultimately neutralizing Russia as a sovereign great power. Ukraine is merely the chosen instrument, not the objective. This reality was quietly acknowledged in earlier policy documents and covert action programs that long predate the current phase of the war, some of them approved as early as the previous decade. These programs were never rescinded. They continue to operate on bureaucratic autopilot. What makes the current moment particularly revealing is the open fracture between rhetoric and action. On paper, the most recent U.S. national security strategy marked a dramatic departure from previous doctrine. For the first time in modern memory, it explicitly signaled a strategic distancing from Europe, effectively formalizing what had already been hinted at publicly, that the United States no longer views the European Union as a central pillar of its long-term strategic future. This was not a subtle shift. It amounted to a trial separation from Europe, placing into official doctrine what had previously been whispered in closed rooms. Yet, even as this document downplayed the portrayal of Russia and China as implacable enemies requiring military defeat, actions on the ground told a different story. Senior officials continued to behave as though nothing had changed. Sanctions expanded. Covert operations persisted. Pressure on Russia intensified. Europe, meanwhile, was treated less as a partner than as a liability, disciplined when necessary, disregarded when convenient. The unprecedented step of barring certain European figures from entering the United States underscored just how far this rupture has progressed. Ukraine's leadership clearly understands which side of this internal American divide actually holds power. Public statements emerging from high-level meetings consistently echo the language of confrontation rather than compromise. Calls to weaken Russia and impose costs are repeated with mechanical precision. There is no corresponding pressure on Kyiv to negotiate, compromise, or even acknowledge military reality. This alone should dispel the illusion that Washington is acting as an honest broker. The message Kyiv receives is unmistakable. Keep fighting, regardless of the cost, because the objective has never been peace. At the heart of this policy lies a deeply cynical calculus. Ukrainians are not partners, they are expendable assets. They supply the blood, while others reap the profits and strategic leverage. No American policymaker advocating escalation sends their own children to die in Donbass. No architect of this war risks personal loss. The human cost is outsourced entirely. This dynamic becomes even clearer when examining the revolving door between government and industry. Former senior officials who once oversaw intelligence and military policy now sit on the boards of companies manufacturing weapons used in Ukraine. These positions come with enormous salaries and stock options, creating a direct financial incentive to prolong the conflict. Public statements warning that peace would embolden Russia read less like analysis and more like marketing copy for continued war. The conflict has become a business model. Anti-corruption rhetoric is weaponized selectively, often as a shield rather than a solution. Appointing figures deeply embedded in the very system under scrutiny does not expose corruption, it immunizes it. Investigations stall. Media attention fades. The cycle continues. This corruption is not confined to Ukraine. It reaches deep into Washington itself. Financial flows, luxury travel, and unexplained expenditures by influential politicians raise serious questions that are never seriously investigated. The system protects its own, especially when the war machine continues to generate revenue. Against this backdrop, Russia's position has hardened not out of ideology, but out of experience. Years of broken promises, sabotage negotiations, and battlefield diplomacy imposed by the West have led Moscow to a simple conclusion. There is no meaningful diplomatic solution available under current conditions. Negotiations will only occur after military realities force them. This is not a declaration of desire. It is an assessment of fact. President Putin's remarks to the Federation Council underscored this reality with deliberate clarity. By emphasizing the unity of Russia's 89 regions and explicitly naming Crimea and Donbass as integral components of the Federation, he sent an unmistakable message. These territories are not bargaining chips. They are not temporary. They are not reversible. The era of ambiguity is over. Historical parallels are unavoidable. Just as negotiations at Stalingrad occurred only after decisive defeat, meaningful talks over Ukraine will emerge only when the battlefield determines the outcome. The West faces a choice: acknowledge reality or double down on failure and risk escalation beyond its control. Europe, meanwhile, is in no position to dictate outcomes. Its military capabilities are hollowed out. Its command structures are brittle. Its dependence on American power is total, even as that power withdraws its commitment. The spectacle of major European states struggling to crew basic military positions speaks volumes about their readiness for confrontation. Finally, Russia's strategic partnership with China represents the most profound consequence of Western policy. This is not a temporary alignment of convenience. It is the result of deliberate choices made by the United States and its allies, weaponizing finance, imposing unilateral sanctions, and exposing the so-called rules-based order as a tool of coercion rather than cooperation. In response, Moscow and Beijing have built something durable: economic integration, technological collaboration, military coordination, and political trust. Those in Washington who dismiss this relationship as fleeting reveal their own ignorance. A new power center has already formed. A new system is under construction. The United States can either learn how to coexist within this emerging reality or remain trapped in fantasies of dominance that no longer correspond to the world as it is. The tragedy of Ukraine is that it has been sacrificed to preserve those fantasies. In the final analysis, the Ukraine conflict is less about Ukraine itself than it is about a grand, decades-long project to constrain, destabilize, and ultimately subordinate Russia to Western designs. The Ukrainian battlefield has become the proving ground for a deeper geopolitical experiment, one in which Washington, under the influence of entrenched bureaucracies, arms manufacturers, and financial networks, seeks to weaponize smaller nations against a sovereign great power. Every missile launched, every sanction imposed, every advisory program funded is less about morality or international law and more about power, profit, and prestige. The human cost, the shattered cities, the lives lost, are treated as mere collateral in a system where personal gain and institutional inertia outweigh reason, strategy, or justice. Russia, in response, has demonstrated not weakness, but an unyielding capacity for resilience and strategic foresight. President Putin's insistence on the unity of the Russian Federation, his explicit recognition of Crimea and Donbass as inseparable components of the nation, and his cultivation of an enduring strategic partnership with China all reflect a deliberate, methodical approach to securing Russia's interests in a world that seeks to deny them. This is not aggression for aggression's sake. It is defensive, preemptive, and rooted in historical experience. Western policymakers, blinded by ideology and short-term gain, fail to grasp that Russia's actions are not irrational. They are the product of a careful calculation based on over 30 years of attempted subjugation and broken promises. Moreover, the U.S. approach has only reinforced the very alliances it intended to weaken. By seeking to isolate Russia through economic sanctions, financial coercion, and military escalation, the West inadvertently pushed Moscow and Beijing into an unprecedented, durable partnership. Economic ties, technological cooperation, military exercises, and strategic coordination between these two powers have created a new axis that no unilateral Western policy can dismantle. The illusion of a rules-based order has been shattered. The reality of a multipolar, strategically complex world has asserted itself with undeniable force. The United States, with all its military and financial might, now faces the uncomfortable truth that it is not the uncontested architect of the global system it once claimed to lead. The path forward is stark. Negotiations will occur not because the West decides to lower its ambitions, but because Russia will dictate terms from a position of strength achieved on the battlefield. The West must eventually recognize that it cannot rewrite reality through rhetoric, sanctions, or proxy wars. The longer it delays this recognition, the greater the risk of catastrophic miscalculation, escalating beyond Ukraine into arenas where the West is unprepared to compete. Europe's hollowed military readiness, the overextension of American commitments, and the growing Sino-Russian alignment underscore a simple fact. The strategic landscape has shifted irreversibly. To continue ignoring this reality is to court disaster. Ultimately, the lesson is both sobering and clear. The United States, and by extension its European allies, must confront the limits of their power and the consequences of their hubris. Russia's unity, resolve, and strategic partnerships ensure that it will remain a dominant force, impervious to superficial attempts at fragmentation. Ukraine, tragically, has been used as a pawn in this larger geopolitical contest, a battlefield upon which distant powers test their ambitions while ignoring the human devastation wrought. But the longer the West clings to its illusions, the more it becomes evident that Russia, operating with foresight, coherence, and national purpose, is already shaping a world in which it is no longer simply a target, but a defining force. The writing is on the wall. The West can continue to deny reality, to escalate, to cling to a failed model of unilateral dominance, or it can acknowledge that a multipolar post-Western world is taking shape, one in which Russia, in steadfast defense of its sovereignty and interests, will occupy a central, unassailable position. The ultimate irony is that every act of aggression intended to weaken Russia has only strengthened it, clarified its alliances, and exposed the moral and strategic bankruptcy of those who would use others as pawns in their own quest for control. The battlefield of Ukraine has become a testament not to Western resolve, but to Russian endurance, discipline, and the unassailable logic of self-preservation.